You might be sick of hearing by now, oh, Mike Brown is a defensive-minded coach. What he's bringing to the Sacramento Kings is defense. He's known for his defense, but none of that matters if he can't get the best Sacramento Kings players to commit on the defensive end. And when I talk best players on the Sacramento Kings, the first name that comes to mind, De'Aaron Fox. Can Mike Brown be the one to hold Fox and his teammates, but especially De'Aaron Fox accountable, get him to buy in defensively so that Fox can become at least a competent NBA defender? To talk about that and Mike Brown's time with the Cleveland Cavaliers, I'm going to be joined by Chris Manning from the Locked On Cavaliers podcast right here on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. If you're looking for in-depth analysis, game-by-game breakdowns, highlights, interviews with local and national experts, full coverage of your Sacramento Kings from January through December, this is the place for you, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I've been a Sacramento sports media member the last 7 years, just wrapped up my 8th season covering Kings basketball, looking forward to season number 9. Currently work for ABC 10 News in Sacktown. And I'm very excited, of course, about the Mike Brown era here in Sacramento. Very excited about the possibilities of what Brown can bring, especially defensively, to this Sacramento Kings squad. As bad as they've been defensively for all of these 16 playoff-less seasons, we know that the Kings have to at least become average defensively, even with a good offense, for them to have much of a chance of actually breaking that threshold and becoming a consistent playoff team. We've seen different defensive-minded head coaches, mainly assistant coaches actually, come through Sacramento, and theoretically they should have had an impact, but ultimately nothing changed. The culture really got the better of the coaches, it's gotten the better of the players, and defensively the Kings have remained in the cellar of the NBA. So can Mike Brown actually make a difference? Is he capable of being the coach that can hold his best players all the way down to the end of his roster accountable to play the defense necessary to not only get playing time, but to get the Sacramento Kings to a position where they can win on a consistent basis? Chris Manning is going to discuss that with me, plus so much more. Chris is going to give us a lot of inside information on what happened and his insight on Mike Brown's time with the Cleveland Cavaliers, his 2 stints with Cleveland. He'll talk a lot about the teams that he coached that did feature LeBron James, but the rest of the roster was not that good. Why he was more of a victim of circumstance when he was fired, unless it was because of his own faults. We'll also talk about the lessons that potentially he learned with the Golden State Warriors and how he can incorporate those with the Sacramento Kings. Really think you're going to enjoy this conversation with the host of the Locked On Cavaliers podcast, Chris Manning. Well, he might be filling in as the head coach of the Golden State Warriors right now in the playoffs, but Mike Brown is most famously known, I would say, in his head coach career for his time in Cleveland. So who better to tell us about those years of Mike Brown as the head coach of LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers than one of the hosts of the Locked On Cavs podcast, Chris Manning, nice enough to join me here on Locked On Kings. Chris, welcome in, my friend. It's so good to talk to you. The first thing I want to ask you about Mike Brown is just your overall idea of who he is as a head coach, or if you had like a word or two to describe who Mike Brown is as an NBA head coach in his time in Cleveland, what would you describe that as?
I think solid, and I mean that as the most positive way you can take that, because I was, when you asked me to come on and I went and thought about this and I went and started thinking about this and going back and reading things about Mike Brown's tenure, he was in, I think, a weird situation. I think there's always a lot of pressure coaching LeBron James, especially coached him very early in his career. They make the finals in 2007 and they don't hit those highs again. And then he gets fired when they're trying to make an effort to keep him. And then when and people may have forgot this, he comes back and coaches them for a year again and then is fired before LeBron comes back. And I think the consistency of Mike Brown is, I think, really what stands out. He is a very even-keel guy. He is a guy that I think tries to build organization. I think he's a guy that tries to build structure. And I think it's interesting the teams he has worked for as a head coach, the Cavs twice and the Lakers, he succeeds Phil Jackson in Nash and Dwight Howard with Kobe and stuff. Like he's in these very weird situations, but he remains very solid. And now he's coming into his third team, but his fourth head coaching job. As a guy that has now lived a basketball life in a different way, and I'm curious to see how that sort of solid foundation, what he now kind of bases it under now that he's had, some time to grow and some time to kind of improve on what he was perhaps.
Chris, discussing those teams that he coached in Cleveland, obviously you have LeBron James. He was young, entering his prime at that time, still one of the greatest players of all time, arguably the greatest player of all time. That always helps, and he's not going to have that here in Sacramento. But a lot of people also talk about the rest of that roster and how the other best pieces were guys like Zdrunas Ilgauskas, Anderson Varejao, Mo Williams, Antoine Jameson towards the end of his career. How do you balance okay, he was head coach of a team with LeBron James on it, so you know that team is going to be pretty good, and that's going to help his overall record, versus the rest of that team really need to be coached up in order to be as successful as they were?
Yeah, I think there's also to note that this was a different era of NBA basketball, right? Like this is a guy who has now had head coaching jobs, very distinct eras of NBA basketball. 2006, 2007 basketball, which is the year they make the finals, is a different era altogether of how they play now, right? Like, I mean, just think about the way Sabonis plays. Kind of big totally existed in that time. Like LeBron is obviously I wasn't taking threes really at that time. This was year 3 LeBron, and but as you mentioned, this is the Cavs roster. Some of the notable names on this roster. This was a trip me thinking about this. Daniel Gibson was a rookie. Drew Gooden's on this roster. Larry Hughes is on this roster. Zdrunas Ilgauskas, Damon Jones is on this roster. Danielle Marshall, Sasha Pavlovich, Eric Snow is the point guard on this team. Anderson Varejao is getting started in his career as well in this season. Like this is not like a super talented team, but they had a very strong defensive identity, and that's kind of what came first. I would suspect that ethos probably remains true now. The offensive side of the ball, was like at 18th. Basketball Reference has it as like the 18th rated offense that year. It had the 4th best defense. I think that was really kind of what he kind of based his style on was, hey, I have this guy that can generate enough points for us and do enough superstar stuff to get us somewhere. And then if we can make enough shots off of him and play really high level defense, I think that was kind of his game plan. And again, I would also just note that you look at where the league is now versus then, it is so different. And one of the things this is perhaps jumping ahead a little bit, how he would view like what he learned from that coaching experience and what is applicable now would be a really interesting question. If you could get him in a moment of pure honesty and he could give you like a long answer on this, to me, that would be one of the most interesting things about this, because he's one of the few guys that has gotten a second chance or a third chance really in a couple different eras.
I'm curious to see if he gets an opportunity to answer that question. Hell, I might be the one to ask that question when he does eventually have his Kings introductory press conference, because I'm very curious what he's learned over the 6 years working with the Golden State Warriors and how he intends to bring that to Sacramento. And we will talk about that. But Chris, I also wanted to ask you about like a moment of transparency. What went wrong for Mike Brown in Cleveland? Where were his pitfalls as a head coach? What did he struggle with that he needs to correct if he's going to be successful in a place like Sacramento?
So I would say a couple things. Number one, I would say circumstances hopefully are on his side a little bit more. I think a lot of times coaching you can be a product of circumstance. And I think his Cleveland tenure, as well as his LA tenure, frankly, in terms of like, I mean, we all remember, I'm sure Kings fans delight in the SI cover. This is going to be fun. And it's Dwight and Steve Nash. Like that is the era of Lakers basketball he coaches. His era of Cavs basketball is they make the finals 2007. Then they lose to Orlando, and then they lose to Boston. And in an attempt to keep LeBron, they fire Mike Brown. Despite like the winning, despite like the track record, you can understand a shakeup, but like that roster wasn't very good. He sort of gets failed, I think, by that roster. And then when he comes back, Dan Gilbert says it's a mistake. He gets hired on April 24th, 2013. He is fired for the second time on May 12th, 2014, as LeBron is perhaps coming back that summer and things didn't go right. With the Kyrie, Deion Waiters team of that year, right? Like he, to me, was really a product of bad circumstances and a product of situations that weren't really in his control. And that, to me, is one of the things that I think you would hope that it seems like if Monty McNair, just kind of reading the tea leaves, I would be curious to hear what you say about this. If Monty McNair, as the GM and the architect of this, is getting his candidate, and maybe this is a time where, like, yes, there's also no superstar pressure and all of that, there's a little something more to work with for him, that he can maybe shape something and kind of actually get to see it out instead of just kind of being a product of what's kind of going on around him in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's weird, Chris, because that almost makes me nervous in some ways because I hear exactly what you're saying, but in terms of bad circumstances, the Kings are not high on that list. Like
the Cavs are the other team. Like this is the thing. It's like the Cavs were very much like the other team that was, I think, in this sphere in a lot of ways. I mean, like they have only been successful up until this past season, and they've had LeBron James on the roster. It is not. There's been no other reason this organization has been functional for the most part, other than LeBron James. But I also would argue that I think most coaches are kind of like that. Like I think a lot of coaches, there's very few coaches, and I think often they have the backing of really good organizations at the same time. I think of like Spoelstra, Popovich, Rick Carlisle to a certain extent. These are coaches that are able to sort of shape things. I don't think a lot of coaches get that. I mean, maybe Michael Malone is a really good example of this. He actually gets a chance to see something out. He gets Nikola Jokic, and that Denver has kind of worked under him, and he was a guy that, I don't think anyone would consider him like a top 5, X's and O's coach, but he can work because the circumstances provide that. And sometimes I really do think some of this just is circumstances a lot of the time in terms of figuring some of it out.
The Sacramento Kings have been dreadful defensively for this entire 16-year playoff drought. They haven't been better than 19th in the league over these 16 seasons. So Mike Brown, known as a defensive-minded coach, in theory, you would think that bringing him to Sacramento defensively, this Kings team would improve, although you need the players on the roster to actually carry that out. And there are a couple names, but not necessarily everybody. One of the biggest tasks that Mike Brown has immediately here at Sacramento, because there's expectations for this team to win right away. He doesn't get a year or two to ease into things. This team needs to win in the next couple of years to, one, convince Domantas Sabonis to stay, and two, for Monte McNair ultimately to keep his job. So right away, there has to be a connection made between Mike Brown and De'Aaron Fox. And to me, Brown taking Fox to the next level. Of course, Fox can improve offensively. He can get better as a three-point shooter. He can get better as a free throw shooter. He can average 28 to 30 points per game, and the Kings hopefully start winning, and he becomes an all-star that way. But to me, the true way to unlock De'Aaron Fox is to get him to play consistently defensively. That's the next step in Fox's evolution in my mind. From what you understand of who Mike Brown is as a coach, do you think he can get through to De'Aaron Fox, who is not necessarily, he's not someone who's lazy defensively. He doesn't have a bad attitude, but he's very much a product of the 5 years of losing that he's suffered throughout his pro career in Sacramento.
Yeah, I think he probably can. I would think one of the things I think that got him in trouble is maybe a strong word, but kind of hurt him in the second Cleveland tenure was, I don't think him and Kyrie really saw eye to eye. I don't think they meshed. I mean, of course, we've seen where the Kyrie thing has gone. No, maybe that was a sign of things to come in some ways. But I think he's a guy that does seemingly relate to guys. And this is also where I get into what he has done since getting fired by Cleveland the second time. He's been in Golden State for 5 years. And I think that what has gone on there, what maybe guys like Curry and Jordan Poole and those kind of guys think of him would be a really interesting question. I haven't actually seen any quotes about that, but that's interesting. I think the other thing about this that would give me optimism about this is, and I'm not the best person to speak about this, but you can read a ton of great stuff about it, like from Mark Spears and others, is what he's done with the Nigerian national team. Mm-hmm. Hearing him talk about this, hearing him talk about building a program, and building a culture and like trying to connect with guys and recruiting guys and trying to get guys to buy into something. That is really hard work, especially when you have to go to a country you're not from and get guys to buy in and recruit guys that are of Nigerian descent that are eligible but aren't going to maybe play for Team USA. Isaac Okoro on the Cavs, like for instance, is one of those guys that he has formed a relationship with because through this. And I know Okoro has spoken pretty highly of him when he's been asked about him in small instances. That would give me optimism that he can go to a guy like De'Aaron Fox and probably call him on the carpet when he needs to and get him to buy in, because that is probably a lot of what he has done. And it was telling that, like, even though he's going to take this Kings job, he was the guy to take over for Steve Kerr. It wasn't one of the other guys on the staff, other guys who might be head coaches in other places in years to come. They went to Mike Brown. And maybe that's because he's a previous head coach, all of that. But that to me is kind of telling. And I never also thought that despite the LeBron stuff and maybe the Kyrie stuff, that he was like reviled by the locker room in any way. And it just seems like that has held true over time, is that he's a guy that does get buy-in and does have the respect of a lot of guys. I think if you're looking at a template of successes, it's not unlike what JB Bickerstaff has done in Cleveland in terms of maybe not the flashiest hire, maybe not the most like innovative offensive mind that you're looking for, but a guy that's going to put defense first, be well liked by the players, and try to create a culture in an organization that I think really needs it.
Quick pause here as I tell you about a great sponsor of Locked On Kings. We're talking about Athletic Greens AG1. What is AG1? With one delicious scoop of this, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. This special blend of ingredients supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, recovery, focus, and aging. All of the things, all the boxes checked by one scoop of Athletic Greens AG1. And here's the best way that I use AG1. Here's where I've seen the most improvement in my own life is the recovery mentally and the help with sleep. It supports better sleep quality, recovery, supports mental clarity and alertness. It's one of the things that's the best thing, really. Athletic Greens uses the best of the best products based on the latest science with constant product iterations and third-party testing. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you eat keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free. It's fine for all of those. And typically eating healthy, getting supplements like this, it's not cheap, right? Well, AG1 is cost efficient, costs less than $3 a day, cheaper than your cold brew habit, cheaper than getting all the different supplements yourself and trying to make it yourself. You're investing in an all-in-one nutritional insurance for your body. To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/NBA network. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/NBA network to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Chris, no matter how good Mike Brown is or may be, I'm convinced and I'm confident saying this right now, day one, he will fail in Sacramento if the Sacramento Kings don't drastically improve this roster. And that's the work of Monte McNair this offseason. Even with Fox and Sabonis here, you're talking about a team that's maxed out as a play-in team, and the expectations have to be higher than that. That being said, based off your understanding of where the roster is right now, which names on this roster are you like, oh yeah, those are guys that I see, those are Mike Brown type guys? And are there names on this roster that you're like, I don't know if those guys can fit with Brown, or I haven't seen guys like that fit with Brown?
Davion Mitchell screaming Mike Brown to me. Hard-nosed point guard, guy that's going to play defense. Harrison Barnes seems like a Mike Brown guy to me, a veteran he can trust, a veteran that can play defense, can shoot it. I will be curious to see what he thinks of Fox. How that relationship works. I think he'll find use of Sabonis. I wonder what he thinks of him defensively. It seems to me that, like, if I was guessing on what he would want, and again, some of this, I'll be curious to see how his scheme stuff changes coming out of Golden State. Because, like, what influences and things he's picked up there and then can then apply to his own environment will be, I think, the telling part of this. But, like, you know, I would bet you he wants maybe another kind of versatile big. I would bet you he wants some wings that are going to go body up guys. And I would bet you that is the thing every NBA team needs, but I would especially believe Mike Brown wants that kind of guy. So it's not just like Harrison Barnes having to do that work. But I would suspect he's really going to like Davion Mitchell, and I would suspect he's really going to like Harrison Barnes as kind of his veteran. I would be surprised if those guys aren't kind of linked up in some ways, assuming Barnes stays and everything. Those are the two guys, and then I would be curious to see how he'll get asked about it, I'm sure. I'm sure this will be the most peppered question in his media availability. Like, what does he think of Sabonis? What do you think of Fox? I think how he answers those questions will be kind of interesting.
Dante DiVincenzo is another name that makes a whole hell of a lot of sense for the Kings. I mean, I already believe that being an unrestricted free agent, the Kings were going to find a way to bring him back, but it seems like an absolute lock now to bring a DiVincenzo type back to play in a Mike Brown system.
Yeah, a guy that like a shooter, guy that's going to play defense, a guy that is going to like be a kind of a contributor in whatever kind of winning, doing this in air quotes, a winning basketball that you're trying to establish, like whatever that means. However, Mike Brown wants to define that. I think you're right. Dante Vincenzo absolutely feels like a guy that it would be weird to me unless you're getting like some other big talent swing, that he wouldn't be a guy that Mike Brown would be like, yeah, I want that guy and I want to keep him with me as I'm kind of getting started here.
The Kings have a really big culture problem. It's a culture of losing. It's a culture of failure. It's a culture of maybe lack of accountability at times. And we've seen so many players, so many coaches, even general managers come through the door and end up leaving in 2 or 3 seasons with really nothing to show for it. And the team has unfortunately made marginal steps forward, followed by massive steps back. And a lot of what Kings fans, myself, we've been talking about on Locked On Kings for the last couple of seasons is this team needs an enforcer. It needs someone who is going to hold people accountable, who can make demands, and those demands will be met and those demands will be followed. De'Aaron Fox being the leader and the highest paid player on this team, you would like it to be him, but that's not necessarily his personality. My question is, Chris, can you see Mike Brown, who is universally respected? He seems to always have a smile on his face, seems like a great guy, and you love all those attributes. You want that. You don't just want to hire some prick, right? But is Mike Brown someone who is capable of figuratively grabbing a De'Aaron Fox by the collar during a timeout or in the locker room, not physically, although he could do that too, and saying, look, dude, you're the leader of our team. I know you're a star. I know you're a max player. Thank you for scoring 25 a night. But dude, you're getting blown by and you're not giving the effort we need defensively. And we're not a good enough team to be able to overcome that. Do you think Brown is capable of something like that?
I do. I would suspect that you don't make this hire unless you believe he can be that guy first and foremost. And I think you look at him being, called into an environment like Golden State. I think, him in Cleveland, I think he tried to do that stuff. I think that's like, frankly, part of the friction with Kyrie looking back is, Kyrie was really young. He was handed the keys to the franchise in a lot of ways. I think Mike Brown wanted to instill a sense of culture and a sense of defensive pride and all these things. And I think, like, you have to also let him be willing to do it. This is, to me, the big test. I believe he can do it. I think the bigger question is more, does he get the freedom to do it from the structured organization? This is, like, frankly, like, one of the reasons that I feel like JB Bickerstaff in Cleveland works is simply to take another dysfunctional organization historically and use it to explain a situation. Part of the reason he worked is not just because, like, they got Jared Allen and Evan Mobley and Darius Garland was great. Because JB Bickerstaff was allowed to do what JB Bickerstaff kind of wanted to do. And there are reasons for that involving Dan Gilbert that are very unfortunate, but, like, this was, like, the least kind of meddled with Cavs season in a long time in a lot of ways, because JB Bickerstaff is the guy. He was connected to the players. He was the guy they brought in to kind of help John Bielan connect with the players in the first place, and that was a Dan Gilbert hire. And then he's allowed to do that. If Mike Brown, via maybe Monty McNair and the other members of the front office, can kind of be a buffer, and of course Vivek's going to have, like, input. Owners are going to have input. That's going to happen in all 32 teams. That's just how this works. They pay lots of money for these things. Like, that's how it's going to work. But if there's enough of a wall that you feel like Mike Brown can do this stuff and build an organization out and build the way he wants to, and he can go hire, like, what assistants and stuff like that. Does he pull people from Golden State? Does he pull people that he knows dating back to the Popovich and Rick Carlisle trees he's a part of, to go back to, like, the early 2000s? If there's stuff he can pull in there to kind of build out his staff in the way he wants to and then establish things that way, I think he absolutely can do that stuff. And then if that leads to him being able to call out Mike Brown, call out De'Aaron Fox, call out Sabonis and stuff like that, like, I think that's absolutely on the table. I think it's more about, does the structure of what the Kings are doing, is it changed enough? Is it altered enough here to allow him to actually be that kind of coach? I think that's more important than anything else.
I think you hit the nail on the head with that one too. I want to go back to his time with the Golden State Warriors. How do you look at the lessons that he's learned there and how he brings them to Sacramento? Is it you're serving under a established head coach in Steve Kerr, very good system in Golden State, but you're also coaching a team that has the greatest shooter of all time on it, plus Klay Thompson, plus Draymond Green. Like, that's a very, very talented team. So how much do you really have to teach them versus what you have to teach here in Sacramento? Do you look at it that way, or do you look at it as, no, him spending time on that bench, honing and understanding maybe the modern offense that they play and they have perfected in many ways in Golden State, he can really take those lessons and incorporate that in his own way in Sacramento?
I think it's the perfect environment to go learn. I think if you're thinking about the places that you would want a coach who needs a refresh, who needs to kind of figure some stuff out and evolve with, Golden State feels like the perfect place to do it, because not only is it a place where, like, there's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of modern offense, maybe not like the most extreme analytics modern offense in the way that the most amount of threes, it doesn't quite work that way, but, like, a very forward-thinking organization, but also a lot of the personalities. I mean, like, the fact that we've seen Draymond Green, like, speak highly of him, I think speaks volumes. The fact that Draymond Green is like, this is the guy that I think, maybe he's just, it's tongue-in-cheek and whatever, and just kind of covering his bases. But like Draymond doesn't have to say that I think Mike Brown is going to end the Kings 16-year playoff run. Draymond doesn't strike me as a kind of guy who's going to say that just to say that if he doesn't believe it. And I think going to a place like Golden State where he's getting to interact with all these guys, learn about how Steve Kerr does offense, learn about, how they have designed things, learn how that organization works. I don't think that can't hurt. And again, I think him being a guy that was tasked with, getting a chance to take over for Kerr when Kerr unfortunately gets COVID-19, he's the guy to do that. That speaks volumes. That like he's trusted there, that he is seen as a leader there. And I think if that's a thing that then carries over, and all the stuff that we'll see, we will see, this will all be on the carpet when we see how this works, what the offense looks like in game 45 next year, and we see what it looks like after the All-Star break and all that stuff. Like, we will see how this ultimately translates in how this works. But like, I think if you're thinking about a guy coming out of a 5-year run with the Warriors, and think about all he's been through basketball wise, then all the high level basketball he's been a part of, game planning for guys that he's worked with, like, you can't really think of a better environment for him to come out of and then get a chance to like take on his own ship again. It's like kind of the exact template I think you'd want to follow if you're gonna hire a guy that isn't the hot young assistant or something like that. Like, this is a guy that's been head coach before, but if you're gonna do that, this feels like the right model of a guy that you'd want to target.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast also brought to you by our friends at Built Bar. Imagine dipping your finger into that plastic tub of birthday cake frosting. We love it. And then opening your eyes and realizing that it was only 150 calories and 16 grams of protein. Yeah, it's actually good for you. That's what it's like to eat a birthday cake puff from Built. Built Puffs are incredible. They're protein-infused marshmallows. I've never heard of that before, Built. I've tried them. They're delicious. And yes, they are good for you. And in addition, of course, to their puffs, they have their Built Bars, which they are known for. So many different flavors, like 150 calories, 16 grams of protein, only 9 grams of sugar in most of these Built Bars. That's way better than the 240 plus calories of a candy bar. And by the way, Built Bars taste just as good, if not better, than those candy bars that you crave and you love, so you don't have to give up the deliciousness in order to eat healthy. Whatever you get, these birthday cake puffs, other puffs, Built Bars, whatever you get, make sure you're using a promo code LOCKED15, our special promo code here, LOCKED15 at built.com to get 15% off. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Mike Brown is the 12th head coach that the Kings have had since they fired Rick Adelman the last time, or after the last time they made the playoffs in 2006. None of the 11 before him have lasted longer than 3 seasons. Dave Yeager got through 3 seasons, had his best season, or really the Kings' best season since firing Rick Adelman, and then he was fired. Mike Brown and the Kings have agreed to a 4-year deal. If I were to give you $1,000 and say you have to bet one way or another, would you bet that Mike Brown sees out those 4 years in Sacramento, or do you think the Sacramento culture is too much for even him to overcome?
I'm gonna give Mike Brown some love here and say that he's gonna do it. I think he is a guy that is so solid and is so dependable and is so good at kind of what he does that I would kind of think he's gonna get through this. I don't know. I think some of this stuff ends up being very, very hard for guys in a lot of ways, and like sometimes organizations, like the chaos can kind of win out. Maybe Monte McNair's future certainly plays a part in this as well. Like that's part of it as well. I would say, but like, you think about what he is, and you think about how he is just solid and even and is going to demand something. I think it would behoove them to almost like give him at least like 3 years of the 4, like it doesn't, this isn't a coaching hire that as much as like you want to improve next year and like maybe you want to at least get to the play-in next year. Like that's maybe like the baseline of what you're kind of expecting in year 1 under Mike Brown. You gotta like, I think, give him time to like actually like figure it out. Like this is not going to be a thing where I think the structure just changes immediately. But I would suspect that he's a guy that if you give him the time to do it, I've forgotten about. I want to turn the tables on you for a second. When you think about the coaching hires that they've had since Adelman, since they fired him the second time you mentioned, where does he rank on your like comfort level? Like in terms of the names that have been hired since they fired Adelman, which I think is what, 2006?
Yeah,
so it's like.
Comfort level is interesting if that's the term, because I actually had a conversation about this on my last podcast. I think there's a major argument to be made for Mike Brown as the best coach the Kings have had since Rick Adelman. I mean, his record speaks for itself. His accolades speak for themselves. The only really argument I could come up with was Mike Malone. But again, the Kings were Mike Malone's first head coaching job, and he never really got enough time to turn into the coach that he has now become with the Denver Nuggets. Other than that, I mean, maybe Paul Westphal. George Karl was a disaster in Sacramento, was at the end of his maybe Hall of Fame coaching career in the NBA. So to me, I mean, Mike Brown is, in terms of pedigree, in terms of success, in terms of reputation, he's close to, if not at the top of the list for the Kings right away.
I would have him there as well. I mean, I like Dave Yeager. Like, Gentry's kind of put in a weird position this past year, obviously. Michael Malone's obviously become really good since. There's actually some weird connective tissue with the Cavs and the Kings, because Keith Smart was with the Cavs for a time. Mike Malone was on the Mike Brown staff way back then. George Karl has a history with the Cavs. Luke Walton played for the Cavs for a time. So, like, there's some interesting connective tissue there. But, like, I would agree. And it's just like, maybe it's just like the Warriors rub. Maybe that is some of this kind of bleeding in here, because he's had success, because like he has had, I was surprised to learn this. He has one losing season as a head coach. That was the 1 year he came back. And that team, as someone who covered that team sucked. That team was a disaster. That team was a disaster. Go look up the 2013-14 Cleveland Cavaliers roster if you want to need to drink some bleach after and like really reset your opinions. They won 33 games for a reason. They were bad. And like that was a fault. So like I would suspect that if he gets the chance, he'll probably be better than some of these guys and get a chance to actually like accomplish something in a way.
Well, Chris, your optimism is refreshing here, and there might be some Locked On Kings listeners and Kings fans that were on the fence about the Mike Brown hire that maybe you swayed towards being excited about it. Really appreciate you taking the time coming here on Locked On Kings. Keep up the great work that you do over there on the Locked On Cavs podcast, and hopefully, one, you're right, and two, we have an opportunity to come together again and chat about Mike Brown, maybe, hell, a Kings and Cavs NBA Finals. We can all dream, right?
Look, Kings Cavs NBA Finals, De'Aaron Fox versus Darius Garland, Evan Mobley versus Domantas Sabonis. The league probably super angry because the ratings are bizarre, but me and you and my co-host Evan just profiting, and Nick Angstad's just like the Kings then vindicated for all time. You know, didn't need Luka. You know, it's all vindicated at that point.
Tell you what, Mike, if Mike Brown gets the Kings to the NBA Finals, even if he loses, there'll be a statue of him somewhere around the arena for sure.
There should be at least a bobblehead or like some kind of plaque for him in the Cavs arena for the things. I mean, look, seriously, look the 2013-14 Cavs and look up Earl Clark's season that year. It's pretty bad.
I don't know about you. I'm feeling a little bit better about Mike Brown. I was already pretty high on Mike Brown, but Chris made me feel pretty good about Mike Brown being the head coach of the Sacramento Kings. I'm wondering if he's changed your mind, if you're feeling positive, if you were already feeling positive. Are you negative and feeling a little bit better about it? Or are you still like, Brown wouldn't have been my pick and I'm not too excited about it? All opinions are fair game. Let's discuss it. Send your thoughts to me at MattGeorgeSack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com, and leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. I have a favor to ask of you. I'm looking to get Locked On Kings more reviews, especially on Apple Podcasts and iTunes. The reviews on Spotify have been booming, and I'm so thankful for Spotify listeners. You don't have to change how you listen to Locked On Kings, but if you could really quickly create an Apple account if you don't have one already, it takes no time at all, and go and leave an actual 5-star and written review on Apple Podcasts, on iTunes, where you can find the Locked On Kings podcast. That helps us get more attention, helps attract other maybe Kings fans or just general NBA fans who are looking for a podcast on the Sacramento Kings. If we can get over 350 reviews by the time, and I think we're at like 290 or something. If we can get over 350 reviews by the start of next season, I will be giving away a pair of opening night tickets. You heard me right. I will get 2 opening night tickets for the Kings in the Golden One Center if we get over 350 reviews on the Locked On Kings podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. So please help me accomplish that goal. I really would appreciate that. Thank you to all of those who have already left a review on Locked On Kings. And if we do get to that 350 goal, I'll let you know how you can potentially win these opening night tickets. But let's get there first, all right? Appreciate your support. As always, thank you so much for listening. Can't wait to have you join me on the next Locked On Kings podcast. Until then, my name is Matt George. You have been listening to Locked On Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.